Dead Space is a franchise that didn't get the ending it deserved. The first 2 games in the series were 2 of the best horror games ever made. The third one is not. Dead Space 3 came out at a time where AAA publishers seemed to think that horror games needed to become something else in order to stay relevant. These were dark times. From 2009 to 2013, we had big-name horror games come out and just not be scary anymore. The biggest factor in this decline of genuine horror games in the AAA sphere was the inclusion of multiplayer into traditionally single-player horror experiences. Games like Resident Evil 5 and 6, Fear 3, and Dead Space 3 all added co-op. Now, I'm not saying that co-op horror games can't be fun, but they aren't really scary for the most part. There was also a move towards more action-heavy horror games instead of tense, atmospheric survival or psychological horror. Dead Space 3 took it one step further, however, by including microtransactions in the game, which was fairly new at the time for full-price releases. That practice has unfortunately become far more commonplace as the years have gone on, but Dead Space 3 was a trailblazer in that regard. But beyond the embarrassing microtransactions and the needless insertion of co-op multiplayer, Dead Space 3 just wasn't nearly as good as the first 2 games. The disappointing critical and commercial reception of Dead Space 3 eventually led to EA closing down Visceral Games after a few other projects didn't pan out. It was a sad, unfitting end to a great studio and series. Fast forward to 2023 and EA has decided that now is the opportune time to bring back Dead Space, and they're not wrong. Horror games never really went away, as the torch was being carried by smaller budget and/or indie games. AAA horror games, however, have had a resurgence in the last few years, and this year in particular has seen the release of 3 superb horror games with the release of Resident Evil 4 Remake, Alan Wake 2, and the Dead Space Remake. Because yeah, this game is fantastic. I played Dead Space Remake on my PC for 2 playthroughs, the first on normal difficulty and the second on New Game Plus on hard difficulty. However, my PC isn't really top of the line these days, so I actually couldn't record footage while playing. My PC just wouldn't, even on the lowest settings. I ended up borrowing my brother's copy on Series X for the footage. That is the footage for this video. I only played the first couple hours on easy mode to record footage. I will have a spoiler part of this video where I talk about changes made to the story and how they compare to the original game, but I'll give a spoiler warning and timestamp to avoid them. The game looks phenomenal with incredible lighting, particle effects, and art direction. The Ishimura spaceship the game takes place on is a sight to behold, as it was 15 years ago in the original game. What made the Ishimura so memorable was the art direction and design. It's a mining vessel meant for cracking planets and extracting the materials. As such, it's pretty utilitarian. There's very little in the way of comfort and art beyond the various ads and propaganda hung up on walls. The ship is metal and dark, cold and cramped, imposing and oppressive. Even without the necromorphs, this wouldn't really be a nice place to live and work in, and that feeling is captured flawlessly by the visuals. And obviously the gore-splattered walls with warnings written in blood lend a certain je ne sais quoi to the horrific ambiance. Each area is dense with environmental storytelling, desks littered with papers strewn about and fallen on the floors, small encounters with survivors leaving a traumatizing impact, and walking into a room and seeing the aftermath of whatever horrific event happened there. The moody lighting is excellent, flickering brightly through fog, steam, and smoke that feel tangible and dense. The ship is very dark in a lot of areas, and light sources poke out from the shadows to guide you, along with your own flashlight. The remake carries over one of the most iconic aspects of the original game, its diegetic HUD. Everything you need to access during gameplay is actually represented in the game world in some way and doesn't pause the game. Isaac's health is a blue segmented spine on his back, his stasis module a half circle next to it. His inventory and map screens are projected in front of him, and the wayfinder is projected onto the floor. It's one of the best designed game interfaces I've ever seen, and it does a hell of a lot to add to the immersion of the game. You enter save stations and stores by walking up to them, and the camera just zooms in real time while you do your business. You can even be attacked while doing this by enemies, so watch your back. Of course, there is a pause menu where you can tweak your settings and whatnot, but everything game related is in real time. When God of War 2018 came out, there was a lot of praise for the game's desire to never cut away from Kratos. It was impressive, but I would like to give credit to Dead Space 2 as that game did it first. Dead Space Remake also does the same thing, where the camera never cuts away from Isaac. I mean, there are clearly parts where the developers stretched that idea, but yeah, the camera never completely cuts away. I will say though that I do kind of feel like the new suit, while still looking really cool, is maybe a bit too busy. The original suit was a pretty basic looking thing at the start, but as you upgraded it, it became more heavy duty over the course of the game. The new suit starts off looking pretty heavy duty, and as a result the upgrades didn't have the same visual impact as they did previously, at least not for me. But the attention to detail on the suit is incredible. Like if you kill necromorphs close to Isaac, the suit will get covered in blood, or the suit will get frozen in cold areas. The game's sound design is great. The echoes of distant voices screaming, the shrieks of the necromorphs reverberating in claustrophobic hallways, the little audio cues that signal a completion of an objective. It's very well done. There are quite a few videos on the official Dead Space YouTube channel that go into detail on the making of the game, which I will link in the description if you're curious. The developers Motive Studio came up with something called the Alive system, which is meant to make Isaac's breathing and the sounds that he makes seem more natural. Like if he's running out of oxygen in a zero gravity section and then you get back inside the ship, Isaac will slowly regulate his breathing across a few seconds instead of instantly being able to breathe normally again. They even had the voice actor for Isaac, Gunnar Wright, who is the original actor who played him in Dead Space 2 and 3, record 3 different versions of basically every line of dialogue in the game, and which version you hear is dependent on how much health Isaac has in that moment. If he has high health, he'll sound fine, but if his health isn't that high or pretty low, he'll sound more ragged, tired, and worn down. The voice acting is a bit of a mixed bag, which I'll get into more when I get to the story section of this video. I will say here though that regardless of differences between the original and remake, I do think that overall the voice acting isn't as good in the remake as it was before. Most of the actors do a decent job, especially Gunnar Wright, who gives an excellent performance, but there are some characters that just don't have convincing performances in my opinion. The score is great for what it is. It's a scary, intense, atmospheric soundscape with the occasional more melodic part. It's got squealing violins, clanging and crashing percussion, and all manner of ominous and foreboding noises. It fits the game really well. It's just not the kind of music I would listen to on its own. So the game looks and sounds fantastic, but how well does it run? My rig, pun intended, is not a top-of-the-line PC, but it was able to run the game with a pretty stable 60 frames per second on medium to high settings. There was plenty of pop-in, but it's not a huge deal. The game actually goes directly into gameplay when you load a file with no loading screen at all, which is quite impressive. Unfortunately, there was quite a lot of stuttering throughout my playthrough, which mostly occurred when entering new areas of the ship. The stutters didn't last long, but they were frequent and noticeable, which is becoming a bad trend in PC releases. In the future, humanity has expanded out into space in order to mine asteroids and crack planets for their resources. You play as Isaac Clarke, an engineer sent out with a small team to respond to a distress call from a gargantuan planet-cracking vessel called the Ishimura. Isaac isn't there just to do his job, however, as his girlfriend Nicole is working as a senior medical officer on the ship, and he's hoping to reconnect with her after being apart for some time. The tethering systems malfunction when Isaac's vessel attempts to dock on the Ishimura, causing them to make a crash landing. When the crew enter the Ishimura, it becomes clear pretty quickly that shit has hit the fan. There are zombie-like creatures dubbed necromorphs infesting the entire ship and have killed the majority of its occupants and reanimated their dead flesh into monsters. Isaac needs to find Nicole and find a way off the ship before he succumbs to the dangers on board. Dead Space 2023 takes what was there in the original game's story, expands on it, and adds more to it, but also makes some changes here and there. Now, just because there's more story doesn't necessarily mean the story is better, but we'll get to that. The game brings back a lot of the original text logs and audio recordings and adds new ones. It also takes some of those logs and changes them into holographic recordings that play out in specific rooms. One of the biggest changes made to the story is that Isaac speaks now. In the original game, Isaac was a silent protagonist, never uttering a single word, and only taking off his helmet to show his face in the final minute of the game. Now Isaac speaks all the time and shows his face a few times throughout the game. I wasn't really sure how I'd feel about it going into the remake, but I do think that Motive did a really good job of capturing Isaac's personality and integrating his dialogue into the story when it wasn't previously there. There are now a few cutscenes that take control away from the player that weren't previously there, like when Isaac sees the Infector for the first time. The developers actually talk about the scene specifically in one of the making of videos, and I can understand why they felt like this sort of change was warranted. Personally, I'm not entirely convinced, but I don't have a problem with with them. What I do have a problem with are unskippable cutscenes and conversations. You cannot skip any story content in the game, which makes multiple playthroughs feel more like a chore than they should. I still cannot believe that there are new games that don't allow the player to skip cutscenes. I can understand why developers wouldn't want players skipping story content for the first playthrough, but come on, at least let us do it on subsequent playthroughs. I mentioned it earlier in the video, but I just don't think that the voice acting is as convincing in the remake. In the OG Dead Space, the characters sound afraid and stressed, even panicky at points because, well, they're trapped on a ship in the middle of space with zombie monsters killing everything that moves. I'd be pretty fucking stressed too. But in the remake, everybody's just kinda calm and not that bothered by it. It's weird, and I have to believe that it's the direction that the actors were given and not the actors themselves, except for Gunnar, he's still great. Before getting into spoilers, I'll sum up what I think about the story. It's good. It's not gonna blow you away, but there is more depth here than it appears at first glance, especially if you explore the lore of Dead Space's world and come to understand the game's cult-like religion unitology and how it relates to the marker and its connection to the necromorphs. I think the writing is decent, but I do think the game isn't as tightly paced as the original. Alright, on to spoilers now. Skip to the timestamp to avoid them. Just for some context, in case you don't know, in the world of Dead Space there is a very widespread cult religion called unitology that essentially worship these alien artifacts called markers. Markers are responsible for turning people into necromorphs. They mess with people's heads, make them hallucinate, and eventually cause them to go insane, killing people around them and usually themselves. EarthGov, which is the government of Earth, uncovered an alien black marker, and upon realizing that it could potentially be a source of limitless energy, reversed engineered it and created red markers. These red markers were tested on isolated colonies in space, but ended up causing all the settlers to turn into necromorphs, and EarthGov covered up the entire thing. Obviously, there are a few more details that I glossed over, but that's the gist of it. Isaac's relationship with Nicole gets a little bit of backstory in the remake. Nicole was working with Isaac's mom to deprogram her from the cult of unitology, and that's how Isaac met Nicole. Unfortunately, Nicole believed that his mother had been successfully deprogrammed, only for her to kill Isaac's father, then herself. Isaac blamed Nicole for that, and so that's why he's going to the Ishimura to try and reconcile with her. It's an interesting addition, but I'm not sure if it was necessary. I don't really think that Isaac needed a reason to go to the Ishimura beyond, I want to see my girlfriend that I've been apart from for months, but I don't think it takes away anything. What does feel like a downgrade is Hammond's story. It has been changed to be more tied with Chen, a character that has a handful of lines and is only in the first 10 minutes in the game before he gets killed and turned into a necromorph. It does a good job of showing how the marker can manipulate people with hallucinations, but I as the player don't give a shit about Chen because I don't know anything about Chen, so it kind of falls flat emotionally for me when Hammond's whole death revolves around Chen. The late game twist has also been changed. Originally, Isaac had been seen and interacting with Nicole a few times during the game, which were revealed to be hallucinations at the end and that Nicole had been dead the whole time. Nicole is still dead before Isaac even lands on the Ishimura in the remake, however the hallucination angle is changed. There is another survivor on the ship named Elizabeth Cross, who has a partner named Jacob Temple. At the end of the game, it's revealed that the marker has been making Isaac see Elizabeth as Nicole, and Elizabeth has been seeing Isaac as Jacob the entire time. I actually think this twist makes a little more sense now, considering that in the original game, Nicole actually interacted with things in the world and opened doors and stuff for Isaac, but that couldn't actually be the case because she was never there. She was just in Isaac's head. The change does make it so there was a person there that could interact with the environment. I do have to assume that the marker also changed what each character was hearing as well, since Isaac calling Elizabeth Nicole and Elizabeth referring to Jacob as Isaac would have made each character realize that something was wrong. Dr. Mercer's part in the story has been increased, but I don't really care about him. He just comes off like a cartoon villain. In fact, I liked him better in the original because he was actually so crazy that he just allowed himself to be transformed into a necromorph because he thought that was his holy duty, but in the remake he just gets killed. The more things change, the more they stay the same, but there have been a lot of changes to the way Dead Space plays. I haven't played the original game in years, so I don't remember every difference in the remake from the original, but there are quite a few. Isaac is far more agile and mobile this time around, with controls that feel less tanky and clunky. But don't worry, he's not jumping around like he does in Fortnite. Isaac can stomp on crates or defeated necromorphs for resources, and he can backhand the Zambonis when they get a little too close for comfort to stun them for a sec. Dead Space Remake brings in some gameplay elements from Dead Space 2, such as being able to use kinesis to fling objects at enemies, like stasis bombs or severed necromorph blades. In the original game, kinesis was mostly relegated to solving environmental puzzles. This was always such a cool mechanic, and I'm glad they implemented it into the remake. Isaac has a stasis ability, which allows him to freeze enemies in place for a short amount of time, which is a great crowd control ability. The in-game map has been changed and is now usable and not a complete mess like it used to be. You still have your waypoint system, so you don't need the map to follow the story, but it's useful for backtracking to find anything you might have missed or can now access. Which brings me to one of the biggest, if not the biggest change from the original. You can freely explore every area of the Ishimura that you've gained access to in the campaign. Previously, once you boarded the tram and left the area, that was it. You could not return to that area ever. But the remake has implemented a fully connected game world, Metroidvania/survival horror style that you can return to whenever you want. And you'll probably be doing just that, as DSR adds side objectives and side quests to the game. Some of these will have you backtracking to complete them, or to collect your rewards for completing them, such as a side quest that requires you to locate various deceased crew members' access cards in order to increase your security clearance to the max, which allows you to unlock all security doors and get the loot inside. I appreciate the idea to add side quests as a reason to return to parts of the ship you've already been to. However, I'm not entirely sure whether or not this change actually improves the game rather than just make it feel different from the original. The idea of being able to fully explore the Ishimura and go wherever you want on it is an enticing one. However, most of the side quests feel kind of underwhelming. A lot of them feel more like completing a checklist to gain a reward rather than being fun to do on their own merit. Go here and press a button to get a thing, or go here and press a button to see a hologram play. The actual side missions themselves aren't that compelling. The original game was more linear, but it felt very focused. This change in the remake results in the game feeling less well-paced and tight. Motive did implement what they're calling an intensity director. When you are backtracking through the Ishimura and veering off the main campaign route, the intensity director can randomly spawn enemies in areas you've already cleared in order to add some more tension and keep you on your toes. There are a ton of side rooms on your path that can be explored. In the original game, you needed to use a power node to unlock them, giving you a risk-reward type of predicament. Would you use your node to unlock the door for the potential of what items might be in there, or would you keep it to upgrade your weapons? The remake changes this. Power nodes are no longer used to unlock any doors. Instead, doors will oftentimes have these powered locks on them, which can be opened by diverting power away from something else in the room. A door might require you to divert power away from the lights, requiring you to fight your way back to it in the dark. Or you might have to divert power away from the oxygen system in the room, meaning you'd have to return to the door and explore it before you suffocate. Personally, I think I preferred the original system more, as it was a more difficult decision. Power nodes are used to upgrade your weapons and Isaac's suit. Previously, Kinesis and Stasis were their own upgrade path on the workbench, but they've now been folded into the suit's upgrade branch. You can find nodes throughout the ship if you look for them. You can also buy nodes from the store, and you get one node when you buy a gun's upgrade schematics from the store. In the remake, there are no blank node spaces to fill to get to the actual stat boosts, meaning every time you spend a node, you will improve your gun or suit, which is a good change. Your guns start off with a certain number of unlockable nodes. To add more branches to continue upgrading your weapons, you have to obtain schematics, which you do by purchasing the one kit available in store per gun and finding them throughout the Ishimura. Each schematic you find also unlocks a special node slot, which gives a much greater effect than regular node slots. The guns themselves are found in-game rather than purchased from the store this time around, which again is a change I prefer. The guns in the remake are pretty damn good, son. It's a varied and satisfying to use arsenal of necromorph slain implements. You have the flamethrower, the pulse rifle, the line gun, the force gun, the contact beam, the ripper, and one of the most iconic guns in gaming, the plasma cutter. Most of the guns have even received changes to their alternate fire, which I think have been universally improved. The flamethrower now shoots down a wall of fire to deter enemies from getting too close, the plasma rifle doubles as a grenade launcher, and the force gun creates a mini black hole that sucks everything into it. However, I do have to say that I think the plasma cutter doesn't feel as good to use as it did in the original. I'm not sure if it's the sound design or maybe a bit of a reduction in damage per shot, but it just doesn't quite feel right to me. I mean, I got used to it, but yeah, it's not the same. Enemy variety was and is a strong point in Dead Space. Everything from slashers that rush towards you flailing their bladed arms, to infectors that transform any dead bodies in the area into necromorphs, to lurkers and leapers and guardians, etc. There are a lot of different types of necromorphs to kill, and it keeps the combat feeling fresh the whole game. Motive implemented a new flesh peeling system that slowly peels away layers of flesh from necromorphs when you shoot them, exposing muscle tissue and eventually bone. It's a gruesome addition that adds to the body horror of the necromorphs. The zero-gravity sections in the original game only saw Isaac being able to jump from surface to surface, but the remake takes a cue from the sequels again and allows you to fully float and fly around in zero-G sections. I do think that some of these sections were a little disorienting, but I think overall it's an improvement. Remakes and remasters seem like pretty simple affairs. You just take what the original version of the game did and make it better by improving the visuals, modernizing gameplay, and doing whatever miscellaneous extras need to be done to make the new version of the game worth playing. It seems relatively straightforward, but we've seen what happens when remakes and remasters go wrong with games like the GTA Remaster Collection or the Warcraft 3 Reforged fiasco, or even games like Resident Evil 3 that cut huge swaths of content from the original without replacing it with anything. So kudos to Motive for doing a stellar job of remaking one of horror's greatest games. Not every change to the gameplay or story are winners in my opinion, but the majority of them are, successfully bringing the Dead Space franchise to a modern audience. The game has fantastic visuals and sound design, a good story with decent acting, and tense and frantic gameplay. I'm gonna give Dead Space Remake a 9 out of 10. I'm really curious to see whether or not Dead Space gets a sequel, and if that sequel will be a remake of the second game, sort of what Capcom's been doing with the Resident Evil remakes, or if it'll be its own thing altogether. Personally, seeing how successful they were with the original game, I'm hoping for the former. If you enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a like, subscribing, and commenting your thoughts on the game. Thanks for watching.